26 years old, still a virgin, and about to sell her body to a stranger, Casey Weston never imagined her mother's dream would lead to this nightmare. Standing waist-deep in the floodwaters that had destroyed everything she'd worked for, staring at the twisted remains of Weston's Corner coffee shop, Casey realized that sometimes desperation makes monsters of us all. Hurricane Helena's merciless surge had swept through just 5 days ago, but the loan shark's deadline remained unchanged. Find $150,000 in 25 days, or face consequences that made bankruptcy seem merciful. The vintage espresso machine, her mother's pride and joy, saved for with careful pennies over 2 long years, lay twisted and broken beneath the murky water. Hand-painted menu boards that had taken Casey months to perfect floated like casualties of war. The carefully restored vintage furniture that had made this place feel like home to hundreds of loyal customers was now waterlogged wreckage. "No, no, no," Casey whispered, her voice cracking as she waded deeper into the destruction. Her trembling hands reached for a waterlogged photo of her mother, the one she'd kept beside the register for luck. The glass was shattered, the image bleeding colors like tears, but she clutched it to her chest anyway. "I'm so sorry, Mama. I failed you." 4 years of sacrifice had built this dream. 4 years of 16-hour days, surviving on instant noodles and determination, declining dates and social events to nurture something beautiful from nothing. 4 years of transforming her mother's dying wish into this cozy downtown haven, where the aroma of fresh coffee and homemade pastries had created a community of devoted customers. 4 years of believing that hard work could overcome any obstacle, all destroyed in one terrible night. Casey's phone buzzed against her hip, waterlogged, but somehow still functioning. The caller ID made her stomach clench with dread. B. Harrington, Loan Services. She almost didn't answer, knowing that nothing good could come from this conversation. But Brielle Harrington wasn't the type of woman who accepted being ignored. "Hello, Brielle," Casey managed, her voice barely steady. "Casey, darling," came the sickeningly sweet voice that had haunted Casey's nightmares for months. "I just saw the news about the hurricane. Such a terrible tragedy. I do hope you're planning to honor our agreement despite this unfortunate setback." Casey's blood ran cold. Even now, standing in the ruins of her life, Brielle showed no mercy, no understanding, no basic human decency. "Brielle, please, you can see what happened. I need more time." "Time?" Brielle's laugh was like broken glass. "Sweetheart, you've had time. 30 days, remember? That storm doesn't change our contract. $150,000 or—" The pause was filled with menace. "Well, you remember what happens to girls who disappoint me." Casey did remember. She'd seen the photos Brielle had shown her, pictures of other women who'd failed to pay, their faces bruised and swollen, their lives destroyed in ways that went far beyond financial ruin. Brielle Harrington wasn't just a loan shark. She was a predator who enjoyed the hunt as much as the kill. "I'll find a way," Casey whispered, hating herself for the fear in her voice. "I'm sure you will, darling. You're such a resourceful girl, and so untouched. I'm sure that innocence of yours is worth something to someone." The cruel laughter that followed made Casey's skin crawl. 30 days, Casey. Not 31, not 30 and a half. 30. Or my associates will pay you a visit, and trust me, you won't enjoy their collection methods. The line went dead, leaving Casey alone with the sound of dripping water and her own ragged breathing. She wanted to scream, to rage against the unfairness of it all, but what was the point? The universe had already made its position clear. "Casey! Oh my God, Casey!" The voice belonged to Sage Barrett, Casey's best friend since college, who came splashing through the floodwater in designer rain boots that probably cost more than Casey made in a week. Sage worked for a high-end marketing firm and lived the kind of life Casey had always dreamed of. Successful, independent, fearless. "Sage, what are you doing here?" Casey asked, wiping her tears with a soggy sleeve. "I came as soon as I heard." Sage pulled Casey into a fierce hug, not caring about the dirty water or the smell of destruction. "I'm so sorry, honey. I know how much this place meant to you." "It's gone," Casey said simply, feeling hollow inside. "Everything's gone. And I owe Brielle $150,000 in 30 days or what?" Sage demanded, but Casey just shook her head. Some things were too terrifying to say out loud. They stood in silence for a moment, surrounded by the wreckage of Casey's dreams. Then Sage spoke, her voice careful and measured. "Casey, I need to tell you something. There might be a way out of this." "What do you mean?" Sage took a deep breath. "I have a client at work. Well, not exactly a client, but God, this is going to sound crazy. There's this businessman, incredibly wealthy, who's looking for a surrogate." Casey's heart stopped. "A what?" "A surrogate. Someone to carry his child. He's offering an enormous amount of money, more than enough to pay off your debt and start over. I wasn't going to mention it because I knew you'd never consider it, but now—" "Are you insane?" Casey's voice rose to a near shriek. "Sage, I've never even— I'm still a—" She couldn't finish the sentence, her face burning with embarrassment. "I know," Sage said gently, "and I know how crazy this sounds. But Casey, you're out of options. The banks won't give you a loan. Your insurance won't cover the flood damage, and Brielle isn't going to wait. This could be your only chance." Casey stared at her friend in horror. "You're asking me to sell my body to a stranger?" "I'm asking you to save your life," Sage replied firmly. "This man isn't some creep, Casey. He's a legitimate businessman who wants an heir. Everything would be done through lawyers, with contracts and medical supervision. It would be completely professional." "Professional?" Casey laughed bitterly. "There's nothing professional about what you're describing." "Maybe not," Sage admitted. "But it's legal, it's safe, and it would solve all your problems. You could pay off Brielle, start fresh somewhere new, maybe even open another coffee shop." Casey turned away, unable to look at her friend. The thought of what Sage was suggesting made her stomach turn, but the alternative, Brielle's associates and their collection methods, was even worse. She was trapped between two nightmares, forced to choose which would destroy her more completely. "What's his name?" she heard herself ask, hating the words even as they left her mouth. "Kane Whitmore. He owns Whitmore Enterprises, one of the biggest corporations in the state. Casey, the money he's offering, it's $200,000. $200,000, enough to pay off Brielle with money left over to start again, enough to buy her freedom from this nightmare, even if it meant entering another one." "I need to think," Casey whispered, still clutching her mother's ruined photograph. "You have 30 days, Sage reminded her gently. "Maybe it's time to consider that some prices are worth paying." As Casey stood in the ruins of her mother's dream, surrounded by the wreckage of everything she'd ever worked for, she realized that Sage was right about one thing. She was out of options. The flood had washed away more than her coffee shop. It had washed away her choices, her pride, and her innocence about how cruel the world could be. In 30 days, she would either find a way to pay Brielle Harrington, or she would face consequences that would make losing her virginity to a stranger seem like a mercy. The decision, it seemed, had already been made for her. Chapter 2. The Devil's Proposition. The devil, Casey discovered, wore Italian leather shoes and commanded attention like gravity. Inescapable, dangerous, and absolutely without mercy. Kane Whitmore didn't acknowledge her entrance into his penthouse office, leaving Casey to stand like a supplicant before his mahogany throne while he finished whatever business commanded his attention. The silence stretched between them, heavy with judgment and the weight of her desperation, while Casey fought the overwhelming urge to flee from this glass tower and the man who ruled it like an emperor surveying his domain. "Miss Weston." His voice carried the refined authority of old money and older power. When he finally lifted his gaze to meet hers, Casey felt her breath catch. She'd expected someone older, someone who looked like the monsters from her worst nightmares. Instead, she found herself studying the most devastatingly handsome man she'd ever encountered, and, undoubtedly, the most ruthless. At 38, Kane Whitmore possessed the kind of masculine beauty that belonged in Renaissance sculptures, sharp cheekbones that could have been carved from marble, a strong jaw shadowed with perfectly groomed stubble and thick black hair that suggested wild passion beneath rigid control. But his eyes held her captive, pale blue like Arctic frost, intelligent and calculating, studying her with the same detached interest a collector might show a potentially valuable acquisition. "Mr. Whitmore," Casey managed, her voice smaller than intended. She'd rehearsed this meeting countless times during sleepless nights since Sage first mentioned his name, but nothing had prepared her for confronting this man who radiated the kind of power that could buy and sell lives with his morning coffee. "Please, sit." The words weren't a request. Everything about Kane Whitmore commanded rather than asked, from his perfect posture to the dismissive gesture toward the leather chair positioned across from his desk like a defendant's dock. Casey sat, feeling like a scholarship student called to the dean's office, hyper-aware of her discount dress and scuffed shoes in this palace of marble and money. His office was a monument to success and intimidation. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the city sprawled far below, while museum-quality artwork adorned walls that probably cost more than most people's homes. Everything was pristine, controlled, perfect, just like the man who reigned over it all. "Kieran Sullivan, my attorney, mentioned you're interested in our arrangement," Kane said, his tone as businesslike as a board meeting. "I trust he explained the general terms?" Casey's throat felt parched. He mentioned you're seeking a surrogate." "I'm seeking a woman to bear my heir," Kane corrected with surgical precision. "Nothing more, nothing less. This is a business transaction, Miss Weston, not a romantic fantasy. You would carry my child for 9 months, deliver safely, and depart $200,000 wealthier. Are you capable of such an arrangement?" The stark coldness in his voice made Casey's skin crawl. He discussed creating human life the same way others might negotiate livestock purchases. "Mr. Whitmore, I should be honest. I'm not experienced with—" "You're a virgin." He stated it like commenting on the weather, completely matter of fact. "I'm aware. Mr. Sullivan conducted preliminary research." Casey's face burned with humiliation. "You investigated me. Miss Weston, you would potentially carry my child, my heir. Did you honestly believe I wouldn't research every aspect of your life, health, and character?" His smile was sharp enough to draw blood. "I know about your coffee shop, your debt to Miss Harrington, your mother's medical expenses that initiated your financial difficulties. I know you've maintained exactly 2 romantic relationships, both ending before physical intimacy. I know you graduated summa cum laude from State University with a business degree, and I know your only legal infractions are 3 parking violations." Each revelation felt like a violation, stripping away privacy and dignity with surgical precision. "You had no right." "I had every right," Kane interrupted, his voice slicing through her protest like a blade. "When you agreed to this meeting, you surrendered that right. This is how my world operates, Miss Weston. Information is power, and I don't make critical decisions without complete intelligence." Casey wanted to stand, to walk out of this sterile office and never return. But Brielle's voice echoed in her memory, along with those horrifying photographs, and she remained seated, loathing herself for her cowardice. The terms are non-negotiable, Kane continued, sliding a thick document across his desk. You would reside at my estate during pregnancy for medical supervision and security. All needs would be provided, including premier medical care. In return, you would follow all medical recommendations, maintain optimal health, and deliver a healthy child. Upon successful completion, you would receive $200,000 and relinquish all parental rights. Casey stared at the contract without reading, words blurring together. Live at your estate? You would have private quarters, complete autonomy when medical supervision isn't required. My housekeeper, Delilah Park, would ensure your comfort. You would lack nothing. Except freedom. Something flickered in those pale blue eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or irritation. Freedom is a luxury you currently cannot afford, Miss Weston. Or have you forgotten why you're here? The reminder struck like a physical blow. Casey closed her eyes, seeing again her coffee shop's ruins, feeling again the terror in Brielle's voice during that morning's call. 24 days remaining. 24 days before Brielle's associates demonstrated their collection techniques. I need time to consider this, Casey whispered. You have until tomorrow noon, Kane replied without hesitation. After that, I proceed to the next candidate. Many women would embrace this opportunity, Miss Weston. Don't let pride override pragmatism. The insult stung, but Casey swallowed her angry response. Pride was another luxury she couldn't afford. That had drowned with everything else in Hurricane Helena's surge. If I agree, she said carefully, when would this arrangement commence? Immediately. Medical procedures would begin within a week, with conception occurring within the following month for optimal timing. His clinical tone made her stomach churn. The process would initially involve artificial insemination, but if unsuccessful, we would explore more traditional approaches. The euphemism hung between them like a sword. Casey's face burned with embarrassment and something else, a confusing flutter of awareness as she imagined what those traditional approaches might entail with this devastatingly handsome, utterly cold man. I understand, she managed. Do you? Kane leaned back, studying her with those calculating eyes. Because I want absolute clarity about what you would be accepting, Miss Weston. You would belong to me for 9 months. Your body, your time, your very existence would be mine to direct. I don't tolerate disobedience, and I have no patience for emotional dramatics. You would do exactly as instructed when instructed without question or complaint. In exchange, you would be compensated generously and treated with basic courtesy. Nothing more. The word belong sent chills down Casey's spine. She would belong to him, like property, like one of his expensive possessions displayed in this sterile office. What about afterward? She heard herself ask. After the baby arrives? You disappear from our lives completely. No contact, no visits, no maternal instincts or reconsiderations. The child would be mine alone to raise. You would be compensated and forgotten. Forgotten. The word echoed in the silence, final as a tombstone inscription. Casey stared at this man who spoke of creating life and discarding its mother with the same ruthless efficiency he probably used to close corporate acquisitions. You're asking me to abandon my child, she said softly. I'm asking you to fulfill a contract, Kane corrected harshly. The emotional attachment you're imagining is precisely why this arrangement includes psychological evaluation and counseling. You would be carrying my heir, not your child. The sooner you understand that distinction, the smoother this will proceed for everyone involved. Casey felt something breaking inside her, some last vestige of the innocent girl who'd believed love and kindness mattered more than money and power. This man wasn't just asking her to carry his child. He was asking her to sell her soul. But sitting in that magnificent office, surrounded by luxury beyond her wildest dreams, Casey realized that souls were simply another commodity in Kane Whitmore's world, and hers, apparently, was valued at exactly $200,000. "I'll provide my answer tomorrow," she said, standing on unsteady legs. "Mr. Sullivan will escort you out," Kane replied, already returning attention to his papers, dismissing her as easily as any other business transaction. As Casey walked toward the door, she caught her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows, small, frightened, completely out of place in this world of power and privilege. In 24 days, she would either belong to this ruthless, beautiful man or to Brielle Harrington's enforcers. Either way, Casey Weston, the girl who dreamed of love and happy endings, was about to disappear forever. The only question was whether she would go willingly or be dragged screaming into whichever hell awaited her. Chapter 3. Innocence in the Lion's Den. Signing her name on the contract felt like signing away her soul, but Casey Weston had learned that sometimes survival requires sacrificing everything you once considered sacred. The pen felt like lead in her trembling hand as she wrote Casey Weston for what felt like the final time as a free woman. Tomorrow she would belong to Kane Whitmore, body, mind, and soul, for the next 9 months. The bitter irony wasn't lost on her that she was trading one form of ownership for another, choosing the devil she barely knew over the one who'd already demonstrated the depths of human cruelty. "Excellent choice," Kieran Sullivan said, his professionally cheerful tone masking what felt like a funeral. "Mr. Whitmore's car will collect you at 9 tomorrow morning. Pack lightly. Everything you require will be provided at the estate." Casey nodded numbly, still staring at her signature. 24 hours ago, she'd been Casey Weston, struggling entrepreneur and dreamer. Now she was simply a vessel, a carefully contracted means to an end for a man who collected people the way others collected fine art. "Miss Weston," Kieran's voice seemed distant. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she lied, standing on legs that felt like water. "I'll be ready." But nothing could have prepared her for the reality of entering Kane Whitmore's world. The limousine that arrived at her modest apartment building the next morning was longer than some people's homes, all black leather and tinted windows that screamed wealth and isolation. The driver, a kind-faced man named Marcus, who looked to be in his 60s, helped her with her single suitcase, a pathetic reminder of how little she owned compared to the man who now owned her. "First time to Whitmore Manor, miss?" Marcus asked as they glided through traffic with the supernatural silence that only unlimited money could buy. "Yes," Casey whispered, watching the city give way to rolling hills and perfectly manicured landscapes that grew more impressive with each passing mile. "Been working for the family for 15 years, Marcus said gently, seemingly sensing her anxiety. "Master Kane can seem intimidating at first, but he's fair. And Mrs. Park, that's the housekeeper, she's been preparing your rooms for weeks. Real excited to have another woman in the house." Another woman. The words reminded Casey that she would be living in Kane's private sanctuary, sharing his space, existing in his carefully controlled universe. The thought made her stomach clench with anxiety and something else she refused to acknowledge. When Whitmore Manor finally came into view, Casey's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't merely a house, it was a testament to 3 generations of accumulated power. The massive structure rose from perfectly maintained gardens, like something from a Gothic novel, pale stone and soaring windows, with turrets and gables that spoke of old money and older secrets. Fountains and sculptures dotted the landscape, each probably worth more than her destroyed coffee shop. "Welcome to Whitmore Manor," Marcus said with obvious pride. "Been in the family since 1892. Master Kane's great-grandfather built it for his bride. 3 generations of wealth and privilege, of people who commanded rather than asked, who owned rather than rented. Casey felt like an imposter approaching the marble steps, a fraud in her best dress from a discount store, about to enter a world where her entire life's savings wouldn't cover a single piece of furniture. The massive oak doors opened before she could knock, revealing a woman in her early 50s with kind hazel eyes and silver-streaked brown hair pulled back in an elegant chignon. Her face lit up with genuine warmth when she saw Casey, the first real kindness Casey had encountered since agreeing to this arrangement. "You must be Casey. I'm Delilah Park, the head housekeeper. Welcome to your new home, dear." Home. The word felt foreign on Delilah's lips, but Casey forced a smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Park." "Oh, just Delilah, please, come in, come in. Let me show you around." Delilah took Casey's arm with maternal gentleness, leading her into a foyer that belonged in a palace. "I know it's overwhelming at first, but you'll settle in beautifully. I can always tell when someone has good bones." The tour that followed was a journey through 3 centuries of accumulated treasures, room after room of museum-quality antiques, paintings by masters Casey had only seen in art history books, Persian carpets that probably predated her family's arrival in America. Everything was immaculate, precisely placed, and utterly without warmth, just like its owner. "The manor has 42 rooms," Delilah explained as they walked through a portrait gallery lined with stern-faced Whitmore ancestors. "Master Kane uses perhaps 10 of them regularly. It gets quite lonely, if you ask me. A house this size needs laughter, needs life." They passed through a music room with a concert grand piano that looked untouched, a library with leather-bound volumes reaching to a 20-foot ceiling, and a conservatory filled with exotic plants, but no signs of human enjoyment. "Here's your wing," Delilah said, opening French doors that revealed a suite of rooms more luxurious than any 5-star hotel Casey had ever imagined. "Master Kane specifically requested that you have complete privacy and comfort." The sitting room was decorated in soft lavender and cream, with a marble fireplace, plush seating, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking what appeared to be a private garden. Beyond it lay a bedroom with a 4-poster bed draped in silk that probably cost more than Casey's monthly rent, and a bathroom larger than her entire former apartment. "It's breathtaking," Casey said honestly, even as she felt like a bird in an extremely expensive cage. "I'm so glad you approve. Master Kane spent considerable time selecting everything personally. He has exquisite taste when he applies himself." Delilah beamed with pride. "He can be quite thoughtful when he chooses to be." Thoughtful wasn't the word Casey would have used for the man who'd spoken of owning her like property, but she simply nodded. "Now, there are some household routines we should discuss," Delilah continued, her tone becoming more serious. "Master Kane maintains very specific schedules. Breakfast is served at 7 sharp in the morning room. He's quite particular about punctuality. Lunch at 1, dinner at 7. He prefers consistency above all else." "Of course," Casey murmured, mentally cataloguing the rules. She was already being trained like an expensive pet. "He typically works in his study until 10 each evening. Business never stops, I'm afraid. He dislikes interruptions unless there's an emergency. And Casey, dear," Delilah's voice dropped to a confidential whisper, "he's not an easy man to understand. He's been hurt deeply, you see, and it's made him guarded, but there's goodness in him, buried deep. You just have to be patient enough to find it." Before Casey could ask what she meant, footsteps echoed in the hallway, expensive Italian leather on marble floors, approaching with the measured pace of a man who owned everything he surveyed. "That'll be Master Kane," Delilah said, automatically straightening her posture. "He'll want to review the household expectations with you personally." Casey's heart hammered against her ribs as the footsteps grew closer. She'd thought herself prepared to see him again, but nothing could have readied her for the impact of Cain Whitmore in his natural habitat. He appeared in the doorway like a king surveying his newest acquisition, impeccably dressed in a charcoal grey suit that emphasized his impressive height and broad shoulders. His pale blue eyes swept over her from head to toe with clinical assessment, and Casey fought the urge to wrap her arms around herself defensively. "Miss Weston," his voice carried the same controlled authority she remembered. "I trust the accommodations meet your standards?" "They're extraordinarily generous, thank you," Casey managed, hating how small her voice sounded in the spacious room. "Delilah, please give us privacy." The housekeeper bobbed her head and hurried away, leaving Casey alone with the man who now controlled every aspect of her existence. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken power dynamics and the weight of the contract that bound her to him. "There are rules," Cain said without preamble, moving to stand by the windows with his hands clasped behind his back. "You will take meals at the designated times. You will maintain a regular exercise routine under medical supervision. You will attend all scheduled appointments without complaint. You will not leave the estate grounds without my explicit permission." Each rule felt like another link in an invisible chain. "You're making me your prisoner." "I'm protecting my investment," Cain corrected without turning around. "You are carrying my heir, Miss Weston. Your health, safety and well-being are now my responsibility. I don't take such responsibilities lightly. What if I need to go somewhere, see friends, handle personal matters? You no longer have personal matters. Your only concern for the next 9 months is the successful completion of your pregnancy." His tone brooked no argument. "As for friends, they may visit here if I approve them first." Casey felt tears threatening, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her break down. "I want to be absolutely clear about one thing," Cain continued, turning to face her. The intensity in his pale blue eyes made her pulse quicken against her will. "This arrangement is temporary. You are here to provide a service, nothing more. Don't mistake my providing for your comfort as anything resembling affection or personal interest. You are a necessity, not a welcome addition to my household." The cruelty in his words hit her like physical blows, but Casey lifted her chin defiantly. "I understand perfectly, Mr. Whitmore. You want to ensure I don't develop any inconvenient feelings that might complicate your business transaction." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps that she'd spoken back to him. "Precisely. I'm pleased we understand each other." "We do," Casey said, though inside she was screaming. "Is there anything else, or may I settle into my accommodations?" For a long moment, they stared at each other across the beautiful room that would be her prison for the next 9 months. Casey saw something in his expression that confused her. Was it regret? Longing? But it disappeared so quickly she might have imagined it. "Dinner is at 7, he said finally. "Don't be late." He turned and walked away, leaving Casey alone with the scent of his expensive cologne and the crushing realization that she'd just entered a world where love was a luxury she could no longer afford, and kindness was a weakness that men like Cain Whitmore had long since abandoned. As she unpacked her meager belongings in the palatial suite, Casey caught sight of herself in the ornate mirror above the antique dresser. The girl looking back was still recognizable, but something in her eyes had already changed. The innocence remained, but it was shadowed now with the knowledge of what desperation could drive a person to accept. In 9 months, she would walk out of this magnificent prison $200,000 richer and completely transformed. The question was whether anything of the real Casey Weston would survive the transformation, or if she would emerge as emotionally barricaded as the man who now owned her soul. Outside her window, storm clouds gathered over the estate's perfect gardens, and Casey couldn't help but think they were an omen of the tempest to come. Chapter 4. Hearts Behind Walls. The moment Casey had been dreading and secretly anticipating for 3 weeks arrived on a rain-soaked Thursday evening, announced not by trumpets or ceremony, but by Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell's clinical pronouncement: "The artificial insemination attempts have been unsuccessful. We'll need to proceed with natural conception." Casey's hands trembled as she clutched the silk robe Delilah had laid out for her, the expensive fabric feeling like armor that wouldn't protect her from what was about to happen. 3 weeks of medical procedures, of being treated like a prize mare being prepared for breeding, had led to this moment when she would finally have to face the most intimate act of her life with a man who looked at her like a business investment. "Miss Weston." Dr. Hartwell's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you ready?" Ready. As if anyone could be ready to lose their virginity to a stranger as part of a financial transaction. But Casey nodded, knowing that Brielle Harrington's deadline had passed 2 weeks ago, and only Kane's intervention had kept her safe from consequences that would have been far worse than this clinical seduction. The walk from the medical suite to Kane's private quarters felt like a funeral march. Each step on the marble floors echoed through the silent hallway, while Casey's heart hammered against her ribs so loudly she was certain the entire household could hear it. Delilah had tried to reassure her with warm smiles and motherly pats, but nothing could ease the terror and confusion swirling in Casey's mind. What kind of man makes love to a woman he's paid for? What kind of woman agrees to it? She paused outside his door, raising her hand to knock when his voice came through the heavy wood. "Come in, Casey." He'd been waiting for her. Somehow, that made it both better and infinitely worse. Kane's bedroom was a study in masculine luxury. Dark woods, rich fabrics, and a massive 4-poster bed that dominated the space like an altar of temptation. He stood by the fireplace, still wearing his shirt and trousers, but his tie was gone and the top buttons of his shirt were undone, revealing a tantalizing glimpse of the chest she would soon know intimately. "You look terrified," he observed, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "I am terrified," Casey admitted, seeing no point in pretending otherwise. This isn't exactly how you imagined your first time would be." Kane moved closer, and Casey caught the scent of his cologne, mixed with something darker, more masculine. "What did you imagine?" The question caught her off guard. For 3 weeks, he'd treated her with cold politeness, discussing her condition and needs with the same detachment he might show a favored pet. This was the first time he'd asked her anything personal. "Love," she whispered, hating how naive it sounded. "I imagined love." Something flickered across his features, pain, perhaps, or regret. But it was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "Love is a luxury neither of us can afford tonight," he said, moving to pour himself a glass of whiskey from the crystal decanter on his dresser. "But that doesn't mean this has to be unpleasant for you." Casey watched him drink, noting the slight tremor in his hands that suggested he wasn't as unaffected as he pretended. "Are you nervous too?" The question seemed to startle him. "I don't get nervous, Miss Weston." "Casey," she corrected softly. If we're going to, shouldn't you at least call me by my first name?" He set down his glass and turned to study her with those pale blue eyes that had haunted her dreams for weeks. "Casey," he said, and the way her name sounded on his lips made something flutter deep in her belly. "Are you asking me to pretend this is something other than what it is?" "I'm asking you to pretend I'm human," she replied, surprised by her own boldness. "For tonight, couldn't you pretend that I'm more than just a vessel for your air?" The silence that followed was so thick Casey could almost taste it. Kane moved toward her with the predatory grace she'd noticed that first day in his office. But there was something different in his approach now, a careful consideration that hadn't been there before. "You are human," he said, when he was close enough that she could see the dark flecks in his pale eyes. "And you deserve better than this, better than me." The admission hung between them like a confession, revealing more vulnerability than Casey had ever expected from this cold, controlled man. "Then why?" she asked. "Why this arrangement? You could have any woman you wanted." "Could I?" His smile was bitter. "Women want my money, Casey. They want the lifestyle, the status, the security. None of them want the man underneath all of this." He gestured to the opulent room around them. "At least with you, I know exactly what the transaction entails." "Maybe you've been looking in the wrong places," Casey said softly, and immediately regretted it when his expression hardened. "Don't," he warned. "Don't try to psychoanalyze me or imagine you can fix whatever's broken in me. This is a business arrangement, nothing more." But even as he spoke the harsh words, his hand rose to cup her cheek with surprising gentleness. Casey's breath caught at the contact, her skin burning where he touched her. "I'll be as gentle as I can," he promised, and there was something in his voice that made her believe him. "But I can't give you love, Casey. I don't have any left to give." "What happened to it?" she found herself asking, even though she knew she was crossing a line. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "It was beaten out of me long ago, by a father who thought affection was weakness, and a woman who proved him right." The pain in his voice was so raw that Casey's heart ached for him. Without thinking, she reached up to cover his hand with hers, offering the only comfort she could give. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Don't be sorry for me," Kane said, but he didn't pull his hand away. "I chose this life. I chose to become exactly what my father wanted, successful, powerful, and completely alone." "Alone doesn't have to mean lonely," Casey said, and saw something crack in his carefully constructed facade. "Doesn't it?" He moved closer until his body was almost touching hers, until she could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. "You'll leave when this is over, Casey. They always leave." The sadness in his voice broke something open in Casey's chest. This wasn't the cold, calculating businessman who'd laid out the terms of their arrangement. This was a man who'd been hurt so deeply that he'd built walls around his heart and convinced himself they were necessary for survival. "Maybe," she said softly, "but I'm here now." The words seemed to affect him more than she'd expected. His thumb traced along her cheekbone with reverent gentleness, and when he looked at her, Casey saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Hunger, yes, but also a longing so deep it made her chest tight with unexpected emotion. "Casey," he murmured, her name a prayer on his lips. "Are you certain about this? Because once we cross this line, there's no going back." She thought of all the reasons she should say no, the contract that bound them, the cold way he'd treated her, the fact that this would be her first time with a man who'd paid for the privilege. But she also thought of the pain in his voice when he'd spoken of being alone, the gentleness in his touch, the way he'd said her name like it meant something to him. "I'm certain," she whispered, and meant it. What followed was unlike anything Casey had ever imagined. Kane undressed her with a reverence that bordered on worship, his hands trembling slightly as he revealed skin that had never been touched by another. When she was finally bare before him, he looked at her like she was something precious and fragile, something to be treasured rather than simply used. "You're beautiful," he said, and the wonder in his voice made tears spring to her eyes. "So are you," she replied, and watched his expression shift to something that looked almost like surprise. When he finally joined her on the massive bed, his touch was everything he'd promised: gentle, patient, careful of her innocence. He kissed her like she was made of spun glass, his lips soft against hers, his hands mapping her body with an artist's attention to detail. "I want to make this good for you," he whispered against her throat. And Casey believed him. What surprised her most was how naturally her body responded to his. Every touch sent fire racing through her veins. Every kiss made her arch against him with growing need. When the moment finally came for them to become one, he was so careful, so tender, that the pain was overshadowed by the overwhelming sensation of completion. "Casey," he breathed her name as he moved within her, and for a moment, just one perfect moment, she could almost believe this was about more than business. She could almost believe he cared for her, that this meant something to him beyond the clinical necessity of conception. In the aftermath, as they lay tangled together in the silk sheets, Casey found herself studying the man beside her. In sleep, Kane's face lost its harsh edges, revealing the vulnerability he worked so hard to hide. His arm was still around her waist, holding her close even in unconsciousness, as if he was afraid she might disappear. For the first time since arriving at the estate, Casey felt something other than fear or resentment. She felt something that terrified her more than Kane's coldness or Brielle's threats ever had. She felt hope. And hope, Casey was beginning to realize, was the most dangerous emotion of all when it came to a man like Kane Whitmore. A man who'd convinced himself that love was a luxury he couldn't afford, even as his actions suggested he craved it more than anything money could buy. Chapter 5. 3 miracles, 1 broken heart. At 34 weeks pregnant, Casey Weston thought she had 6 more weeks to prepare for motherhood. She was wrong by exactly 3 hours and 17 minutes. The first contraction hit like lightning at 2:43 in the morning, ripping her from dreams of faceless children calling her name to a reality where her body was no longer under her control. Casey had spent 7 months carefully monitored, pampered, and protected like the precious cargo she carried, but nothing had prepared her for this, the terrifying reality that her body was about to bring 3 lives into the world, whether anyone was ready or not. "Kane!" she gasped, her voice echoing through the private wing as another wave of pain crashed over her. For 7 months, he'd maintained careful distance, checking on her health with clinical detachment, while fighting the growing warmth in his eyes that Casey had learned to treasure like stolen glimpses of sunlight. The door to her bedroom burst open before she could call again, revealing Kane in nothing but sleep pants, his hair disheveled and his face pale with alarm that seemed to surprise them both. For 7 months, he'd been the controlled businessman, but now he looked like any expectant father facing his worst fears. "How long have you been in labor?" he demanded, already reaching for his phone to call Dr. Hartwell. "Just started," Casey panted, gripping the silk sheets as another contraction rolled through her. "Kane, it's too early. Dr. Hartwell said babies born at 34 weeks need intensive care." "Triplets often come early," he said, but she could hear the worry beneath his controlled tone. "Dr. Hartwell warned us this might happen. The baby's lungs should be developed enough." The next hours blurred together in a haze of pain, medical equipment, and voices speaking in urgent tones about preterm labor and emergency procedures. But through it all, Kane remained at her side, his hand clasping hers with a desperation that spoke of feelings he'd never acknowledged aloud. "You're doing beautifully," he whispered during a brief respite between contractions, his thumb stroking over her knuckles. "Our children are going to be fighters, just like their mother. Our children." The words slipped out so naturally that Casey almost didn't catch them, but when she did, her heart clenched with dangerous hope. For 7 months, Kane had referred to them as The babies, or my heir, never our children, never with the possessive warmth that suggested she might be more than just a vessel carrying his legacy. "Kane," she began, but another contraction cut off her words, this one so intense that stars exploded behind her closed eyelids. "They're coming," Dr. Hartwell announced from the foot of the bed. "Casey, I need you to push." What followed was the most intense experience of Casey's life, waves of pain that seemed to tear her apart and rebuild her stronger, all while Kane held her hand and whispered encouragement that sounded more like prayers. When the first cry pierced the air, Casey sobbed with relief and exhaustion. "It's a girl," Dr. Hartwell announced, placing the tiny, perfect baby on Casey's chest. 4 pounds, 2 ounces, but breathing well. Casey stared down at the miracle in her arms, barely the size of a doll, but with such determined lungs and dark hair like her father's. "Hello, beautiful," she whispered, feeling her heart expand in ways she'd never imagined possible. "She's perfect," Kane said, his voice thick with an emotion Casey had never heard from him before. When Dr. Hartwell placed their second daughter in his arms 10 minutes later, Casey watched the most powerful man she'd ever known crumble with the weight of instant, overwhelming love. "Another girl," the doctor announced. 4 pounds even. Look at those strong lungs. Casey looked at her family, because that's what they were in this moment, a family, and felt something shift inside her chest. These weren't just babies she'd carried for 7 months as part of a business arrangement. These were her children, pieces of her heart walking around outside her body, and she would die before she let anyone take them from her. "And here comes number 3, Dr. Hartwell said as the final baby made his entrance into the world with a cry that seemed to announce his displeasure at being evicted from his comfortable home. "A boy," Kane said, his voice barely above a whisper as he held their son. "Casey, we have a son." For a moment, Casey allowed herself to believe in the fairy tale. Here was Kane, the cold businessman who'd bought her services, looking at her like she'd given him the world. Here were their 3 children, healthy and perfect despite their early arrival. Here was the family she'd never dared to dream of having. Then Dr. Hartwell cleared her throat, and the spell shattered like crystal hitting concrete. "Mr. Whitmore, we need to discuss the birth certificates and custody arrangements. The legal department requires your instructions regarding the children's names and guardianship." Casey watched Kane's expression shift back to the controlled mask she knew so well, saw him remember that this wasn't a family moment. It was the completion of a business transaction. "Of course," he said, his voice cooling to its familiar professional tone. "According to our agreement, I'll be taking custody of all 3 children. Miss Weston has fulfilled her obligations admirably. All 3 children." The words hit Casey like physical blows. She'd known this moment would come, had signed papers agreeing to it, but holding her babies made the reality impossible to bear. "All 3, she heard herself say, her voice barely a whisper. Kane's jaw tightened. "The contract specified the birth of my heir. These are my children, Casey. I want all of them." Casey looked down at the 2 precious girls in her arms, then at the boy Kane held, with such careful tenderness. 7 months of pregnancy, hours of labor, and a lifetime of love condensed into 3 tiny humans, and he expected her to hand them over like property. "No," she said softly. "I beg your pardon." Casey raised her eyes to meet his, and Kane seemed to flinch at what he saw there. "Number. The contract specified 1 child. You can choose one, but I'm keeping the other 2. The silence that followed was deafening. Dr. Hartwell looked between them with obvious discomfort, while nurses bustled around the room pretending not to hear the most important conversation of Casey's life. "Casey," Kane said, his voice dangerously quiet, You signed an agreement. I signed an agreement for one child, Casey interrupted, surprising herself with her own strength. One child, Mr. Whitmore, not 3. You want more than the contract specifies? Then we renegotiate. There's nothing to negotiate. These are my children. They're our children, Casey fired back, holding her daughters closer. I carried them for 7 months. I felt them move, heard their heartbeats, sang to them every night. I went through 17 hours of labor to bring them into this world. I gave birth to them. They know my voice, my heartbeat, my love. You can't just take them all because you have money, and I don't. Kane stood abruptly, their son still in his arms, and Casey saw something that looked like panic flash through his eyes. You're being emotional. The hormones from childbirth are affecting your judgment. My judgment is perfectly clear, Casey said, her voice growing stronger with each word. I love these children, all 3 of them. And love isn't something you can buy or sell or put in a contract. You want one child? Fine. But I'm keeping 2, and no amount of money or legal threats will change my mind. Casey, please, Kane said, and for a moment his careful control slipped, revealing a desperation that shocked her. I need them, all of them. They're my future, my legacy. They're children, not property, Casey replied firmly, and I'm their mother, not an incubator you rented for 7 months. The words hung between them like a battle line drawn in sand. Casey saw the exact moment when Kane realized she wasn't going to back down, when the businessman who was used to getting everything he wanted faced the one thing money couldn't buy, a mother's love for her children. What would you name them? He asked suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. The question caught Casey off guard. What? If you keep 2 of them, what would you name them? Casey looked down at her daughters, then at their brother in Kane's arms. Hope, she said softly, touching the cheek of the girl on her left. Faith, she whispered to the one on her right. And Gabriel, she added, looking at their son. Hope, Faith, and Gabriel, Kane repeated, his voice thick with emotion. They're beautiful names. They're beautiful children, Casey said. All 3 of them deserve to be loved, not just provided for. Kane was quiet for a long moment, studying the baby in his arms. When he finally spoke, his voice was harder than winter ice. Fine. We'll let the courts decide. But I'm warning you, Casey, I have resources you can't imagine. I'll fight you with everything I have. Then we'll fight, Casey said, though her heart was breaking even as she spoke the words. But I won't let you take all my children. The contract says 1 child, and 1 child is what you'll get. As Kane walked out of the room with their son, their beautiful, perfect Gabriel, Casey held her daughters and cried for the fairy tale that had just died. For 7 months, she'd allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, the cold man who'd bought her services had learned to love her. But watching him walk away with one of her children to prepare for legal battle proved that Kane Whitmore would always choose his wants over her heart. Hope, she whispered to her daughters. Faith, Mama's going to fight for you both, whatever it takes. The war for her children was about to begin, and Casey knew that no matter who won, they would all lose something precious in the process. But as she looked down at her daughters' sleeping faces, she also knew that some things were worth fighting for no matter the cost. Love was worth fighting for, her children were worth fighting for, and if Kane Whitmore wanted to take that away from her, he was going to learn that a mother protecting her young was the most formidable opponent he'd ever faced. Outside her window, dawn was breaking over the estate's perfect gardens, but Casey felt like her world was ending. The man she'd fallen in love with had just proven that contracts mattered more to him than the family they'd created together. But as hope and faith stirred in her arms, Casey felt her resolve strengthen. She would fight for them, She would fight for all three of her children, even if it meant destroying any chance of love with their father, because some battles were more important than happy endings. Chapter 6. Battle Lines in Court. 3 weeks after giving birth to triplets, Casey Weston sat in family court feeling like David facing Goliath, except Goliath wore a $5,000 suit and had an army of lawyers ready to prove that love was no match for unlimited resources. "The matter before this court today," Judge Rowan Mitchell announced, her authoritative voice carrying the weight of Solomon's wisdom as she surveyed the packed courtroom, "concerns the custody of 3 minor children born from a surrogacy arrangement between petitioner Cain Whitmore and respondent Casey Weston." Casey's hands trembled as she clutched the photos of Hope, Faith, and Gabriel, 3 weeks old now, and every day without them felt like dying slowly. Across the aisle, Cain commanded an army of attorneys in Italian suits, their leather briefcases undoubtedly filled with contracts and precedents designed to reduce her children to legal commodities. Her court-appointed attorney, Janet Rodriguez, looked painfully young beside the silver-haired legal powerhouse that was Marcus Sterling. But when Janet stood to address the court, her voice carried a passion that money couldn't purchase. "This case represents a fundamental question about parental rights versus contractual obligations," Janet began. "My client carried these children for 7 months, gave birth to them, and has clearly established maternal bonds. The contract specified 1 child. She's willing to honor that agreement while exercising her parental rights to the remaining 2 children." Marcus Sterling rose with theatrical precision, his presence commanding immediate attention. "With respect, this is a straightforward contract enforcement matter. Miss Weston entered into a binding legal agreement with full knowledge of the terms. The unexpected birth of triplets doesn't void the fundamental premise. All children born from this arrangement belong to my client, who has both the means and the legal right to raise them." Judge Mitchell's expression remained neutral as she reviewed the case files. "Mr. Sterling, please present your client's position." Sterling opened his briefcase with courtroom flair. "Mr. Cain Whitmore is 38 years old, with a net worth exceeding $2 billion. He is the CEO of Whitmore Enterprises, a Fortune 500 company employing over 50,000 people. He sought this surrogacy arrangement because he recognizes the importance of securing his legacy and providing his heirs with every possible advantage." Casey forced herself to watch as Sterling painted Cain as the ideal father, wealthy, stable, capable of providing opportunities beyond most people's wildest dreams. She searched Cain's face during this character presentation, looking for any sign that this legal strategy caused him pain. "Miss Weston," Sterling continued, his tone becoming subtly dismissive, "is 26 years old, currently unemployed, and recently declared bankruptcy following the failure of her small business. She entered this arrangement purely for financial compensation, with complete understanding that she would relinquish all parental rights upon birth." "Objection," Janet called out sharply. "Counsel is presenting argument rather than evidence." "Sustained," Judge Mitchell ruled. "Mr. Sterling, please present facts rather than characterizations." But the damage was intentional. Casey felt the weight of every gaze in the courtroom, saw the judgment in faces of court reporters and spectators who'd come to witness this public dissection of her most private anguish. "I call Mr. Whitmore to the stand," Sterling announced. Casey's heart clenched as Cain walked to the witness box. Even in this setting, he commanded attention. Tall, imposing, devastatingly handsome in his charcoal suit. But she could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful control that kept his emotions locked away. "Mr. Whitmore," Sterling began, "please explain your decision to pursue surrogacy." Cain's voice was steady, professional. "I wanted to establish a family legacy," After careful consideration, surrogacy seemed the most practical approach to achieving this goal. Why not pursue traditional relationships or adoption? Casey watched Kane's hands tighten on the rail. Previous romantic relationships proved incompatible with my business responsibilities. Adoption involves lengthy procedures with uncertain outcomes. Surrogacy offered clear parameters and expectations. What kind of father do you intend to be? For the first time, something genuine flickered across Kane's features. I intend to provide my children with every advantage: superior education, unlimited opportunities, complete financial security. They will want for nothing. And Miss Weston's role in their future? Kane's eyes found Casey's across the courtroom, and she saw something that made her breath catch. Was it regret? Longing? According to our agreement, Miss Weston would have no ongoing relationship with the children. No further questions, Sterling said, clearly satisfied with his client's controlled testimony. Janet Rodriguez stood for cross-examination, and Casey held her breath. Mr. Whitmore, you mentioned providing your children with every advantage. Does that include emotional support and affection? Kane's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Naturally. But love isn't mentioned anywhere in your contract with Miss Weston, is it? Janet pressed. Can you guarantee you'll love these children, not just provide for them? The courtroom fell silent. Casey watched Kane struggle with the question, saw his carefully constructed walls threatening to crack under judicial scrutiny. Love is not a legal requirement for custody, he said finally. Perhaps not legally, but certainly parentally, Janet continued. Mr. Whitmore, during Miss Weston's pregnancy, how often did you inquire about her emotional well-being? Doctor, Hartwell provided comprehensive medical reports. I asked about emotional well-being. Did you ever ask how she was feeling, whether she was lonely, whether carrying your children was emotionally challenging for her? Casey saw Kane's mask beginning to slip. Our arrangement was intended to be professional. Professional, Janet repeated. So you treated the woman carrying your children like a hired employee? Objection, Sterling called out. Argumentative. Sustained, Judge Mitchell ruled, but the point had been made. Mr. Whitmore, Janet continued, you testified that previous relationships were incompatible with business responsibilities. Isn't it true that you simply don't know how to maintain emotional relationships? Sterling shot to his feet. Objection. Calls for speculation about the witness's psychological state. I'll allow it, Judge Mitchell said. Answer the question, Mr. Whitmore. Kane was silent for a long moment. I prefer arrangements with clear boundaries and defined expectations. Because emotional attachments are messy and unpredictable. Because they lead to disappointment and betrayal, Kane said quietly, and Casey's heart broke a little at the pain in his voice. Janet returned to her table and Casey was called to testify. Walking to the witness stand felt like walking to her own judgment, every eye tracking her movement. Miss Weston, Janet began gently, please tell the court about your relationship with your children. Casey's voice was barely above a whisper at first. I love them. From the moment I felt them move inside me, I loved them completely. When did you realize you couldn't surrender all 3 children? The moment they were born, Casey said, her voice growing stronger. When I held hope and faith for the first time, when I saw Gabriel in Kane's arms, I realized they weren't just children I'd carried. They were my children, pieces of my soul walking around outside my body. Why are you willing to honor the contract regarding 1 child but not 3? Casey looked directly at Judge Mitchell. Because that's what our agreement specified. 1 child. I may not have Mr. Whitmore's resources, but I honor my commitments. However, I won't be compelled to surrender more than I agreed to simply because circumstances changed. How do you plan to support 2 children? I'll work multiple jobs if necessary, Casey said fiercely. I'll provide them with love, attention, and emotional security. Children need more than trust funds. They need parents who are emotionally present. Sterling's cross-examination was surgical, designed to expose Casey as an opportunistic woman attempting to renegotiate after accepting payment. Miss Weston, Sterling said condescendingly, isn't it true that you're fighting for these children because you realize they could be leveraged for additional financial support from my client? No, Casey said firmly. I'm fighting for them because I'm their mother, and a mother protects her children, even from their biological father. Casey looked across the courtroom at Kane, seeing him not as the cold businessman who'd purchased her services, but as the man who'd held her hand during labor, who'd looked at their children with such overwhelming love. Kane could be an excellent father, she said softly, but being a parent requires more than financial provision. It means being emotionally available, prioritizing your children's needs over your own desires. Objection, Sterling called out, but Casey had said what needed to be said. Judge Mitchell called for a 30-minute recess. As the courtroom emptied, Casey found herself alone with the terrible knowledge that regardless of the judge's decision, her heart would be shattered. She'd fallen in love with a man who saw her as a service provider, and she'd brought 3 children into the world who might never know what it meant to have a complete family because their parents were too wounded to bridge the gap between duty and love. When court reconvened, both sides presented closing arguments that felt more like eulogies for a family that might have been. Sterling emphasized contract law and financial security. Janet spoke passionately about maternal rights and emotional bonds. Finally, Judge Mitchell was ready to speak. This case has challenged my understanding of family law and human nature, she began. Both parties have presented compelling arguments. Mr. Whitmore offers financial security and stability. Miss Weston offers maternal love and emotional commitment. Casey gripped her chair until her knuckles went white. However, Judge Mitchell continued, the welfare of 3 newborn children must supersede all other considerations. These babies need stability, love, and the opportunity to bond with both biological parents. The judge paused, and in that silence, Casey heard her future being decided. Therefore, I am ordering an unprecedented arrangement. And Casey knew that whatever came next would change all their lives forever. Controlled testimony. Janet Rodriguez stood for cross-examination and Casey held her breath. Mr. Whitmore, when you say previous relationships proved unsuitable, what exactly do you mean? Kane's jaw tightened. I prefer not to discuss my personal history. But this case is about your fitness as a parent, isn't it? Your ability to provide emotional support, not just financial. I can provide everything my children need, including love, Janet pressed. Because love isn't mentioned anywhere in your contract with Miss Weston. The courtroom fell silent. Casey watched Kane struggle with the question, saw the careful walls he'd built around his heart threatening to crack under judicial scrutiny. Love is not a legal requirement for custody, he said finally. But it should be a parental requirement, shouldn't it? Janet continued. Mr. Whitmore, during Miss Weston's pregnancy, how often did you check on her emotional well-being? Dr. Hartwell provided regular reports on her health. I asked about emotional well-being. Did you ever ask how she was feeling? Whether she was lonely? Whether carrying your children was emotionally difficult for her? Casey saw Kane's mask beginning to slip. The arrangement was meant to be professional. Professional, Janet repeated. So you treated the woman carrying your children like an employee. Objection, Sterling called. Argumentative. Sustained, Judge Mitchell ruled, but the damage was done. Janet Rodriguez returned to her table and Casey was called to testify. Walking to the witness stand felt like walking to her own execution, every eye in the courtroom tracking her movement. "Miss Weston," Janet began gently, "please tell the court about your relationship with your children." Casey's voice was barely above a whisper at first. "I love them. From the moment I felt them move inside me, I loved them completely." "When did you first realize you wouldn't be able to give up all 3 children?" "The moment they were born," Casey said, her voice growing stronger. "When I held hope and faith for the first time, when I saw Gabriel in Cain's arms, I realized they weren't just the children I'd carried for 9 months. They were my children, pieces of my heart walking around outside my body." "Why are you willing to honor the contract for 1 child but not 3? Casey took a deep breath, looking directly at Judge Mitchell. "Because that's what the contract says. 1 child. I may be poor, Your Honor, but I keep my word. I'll honor our agreement, as painful as it will be. But I won't be forced to give up more than I agreed to just because Mr. Whitmore has decided he wants a bigger family. And if you're awarded custody of 2 children, how do you plan to support them?" "I'll work 3 jobs if I have to," Casey said fiercely. "I'll give them all the love they deserve, even if I can't give them trust funds and private schools. Children need love more than money." Sterling's cross-examination was brutal, designed to paint Casey as an opportunistic woman trying to renegotiate a deal after taking Cain's money. But Casey held her ground, her love for her children giving her strength she didn't know she possessed. "Miss Weston," Sterling said, his tone condescending, "isn't it true that you're only fighting for these children now because you realize you could use them to extract more money from my client?" "No," Casey said firmly. "I'm fighting for them because I'm their mother, and a mother protects her children, even from their own father." Casey looked across the courtroom at Cain, seeing him not as the cold businessman who'd bought her services, but as the man who'd held her hand during labor, who'd looked at their son with such overwhelming love. "Cain could be a wonderful father," she said softly, "but being a father means more than providing money. It means being present, being emotionally available, being willing to put your children's needs before your own desires." The courtroom erupted with the sound of Sterling's objection, but Casey had said what she needed to say. Judge Mitchell called for a recess, and as the courtroom emptied, Casey found herself alone with her thoughts and the terrible knowledge that no matter what the judge decided, her heart would be broken. She'd fallen in love with a man who saw her as a service provider, and she'd brought 3 children into the world who would never know a whole family because their parents were too wounded to bridge the gap between duty and love. The battle for her children was just beginning, but Casey already knew that the real casualty would be any chance she and Cain might have had at becoming the family their children deserved. Chapter 7. 7 Days to Choose Love. In 30 years on this bench, I've witnessed many custody disputes, but never one where the solution is so clearly within reach if both parties can set aside pride and remember what truly matters. Judge Rowan Mitchell's words fell like stones into the silent courtroom, where 2 wounded hearts waited to learn the fate of 3 innocent children. Casey gripped her chair until her knuckles turned white, her entire future balanced on the next words from this wise woman who held Solomon's burden. Across the aisle, Cain sat rigid as marble, but Casey could see the tension radiating from every line of his body. "Both parties present compelling cases," Judge Mitchell continued. "Mr. Whitmore offers substantial financial resources and stability. Miss Weston demonstrates fierce maternal love and emotional commitment. However, the welfare of 3 6-week-old infants supersedes all other considerations." The judge paused, studying both parties. The contract specifies 1 child, making Miss Weston's legal position sound. However, separating siblings this young could cause psychological harm. More importantly, these children deserve the opportunity to know both biological parents. Casey's heart hammered as she waited for the decision that would shape all their lives. Therefore, I am ordering a supervised cohabitation period. Both parties will return to Mr. Whitmore's estate with all 3 children for 14 days. During this time, you will function as a family unit while social services monitors the children's welfare and both parents' capabilities. The courtroom erupted in surprised murmurs. Casey felt dizzy trying to process what she'd just heard. This gives both parents equal time with all 3 children, while allowing the court to observe actual parenting abilities rather than theoretical arguments, Judge Mitchell explained. At the end of 14 days, if you cannot reach private agreement, I will make a final custody determination based on the children's best interests, as demonstrated during this period. Marcus Sterling rose immediately. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Mr. Sterling, Judge Mitchell interrupted firmly, these children have been separated from their mother for 6 weeks. They need stability and the chance to bond with both parents. 14 days will provide that opportunity while protecting everyone's interests. Casey found her voice. What if we can't agree? Judge Mitchell's expression was compassionate, but firm. Then I decide based on what I observed during those 14 days and what serves Hope, Faith, and Gabriel's best interests. But I strongly encourage you both to remember that these babies didn't choose to be born into a legal battle. As the gavel fell, Casey felt hope and terror warring in her chest. 14 days with Kane and their children, 14 days to prove she could be the mother they deserved while living with the man who'd broken her heart by choosing contracts over love. The ride back to Whitmore Manor was conducted in tense silence, the luxury sedan feeling more like a hearse. Casey stared out at familiar landscapes that had once represented her prison, but now offered her only chance at redemption. Delilah Park waited at the front entrance, tears streaming down her face as she held baby Gabriel, while 2 pediatric nurses stood by with Hope and Faith. The sight of her children after 6 weeks of separation nearly brought Casey to her knees. "My babies," she whispered, reaching for Hope with trembling hands. The moment her daughter settled against her chest, Casey felt something healing and breaking simultaneously. "Mama's here, sweetheart." She looked up to find Kane watching her with an unreadable expression, Faith cradled protectively against his chest. For a moment they looked like what they should have been, parents reunited with their children, a family complete despite its fractured foundation. "They've missed you terribly," Delilah said softly, dabbing her eyes. "All the pediatric care in the world can't replace a mother's touch. They've been more restless, eating less, crying more." Kane's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "They've received excellent medical supervision." "Medical supervision, yes," Delilah agreed carefully, "but babies need emotional nourishment too. Don't you, sweet Gabriel?" She gently touched the baby's cheek. The pointed observation hung in the air as they entered the mansion. The nursery had been completely transformed during Casey's absence. 3 matching cribs instead of 1, every surface covered with expensive monitoring equipment, designer toys, and state-of-the-art baby gear. Despite the luxury, something felt clinical about the room, beautiful but sterile. "I've prepared the blue suite adjoining the nursery," Delilah announced, leading Casey toward a door she hadn't noticed before. "You'll be close enough to hear the babies during the night, but have your own space." Casey settled into the familiar rocking chair, holding Hope while Faith fussed in her nearby crib. After 6 weeks apart, her daughter felt simultaneously familiar and foreign, heavier, longer, but still unmistakably hers. "She's hungry," Casey said, recognizing Faith's particular cry pattern. "The formula station is fully stocked," Kane said, moving toward the high-tech warming unit with practiced efficiency. Casey shook her head. "I've been maintaining my milk supply for 6 weeks. I want to breastfeed them." The statement clearly surprised Kane. "You've been..." But there was no expectation. There were many things not in our contract, Casey replied, settling Faith to nurse while Hope dozed contentedly, including how I'd feel carrying them for 7 months, or the bond we'd form, or how much I'd love them. Kane watched in fascination as Faith latched on and began nursing contentedly. Dr. Hartwell recommended bottle feeding for practicality. Practical, Casey repeated, the word bitter on her tongue. Is that what we're calling this? Gabriel began fussing in Kane's arms, and Casey watched the powerful businessman look completely helpless, facing one crying baby. He's probably hungry too, Casey said gently. Here, let me show you. She guided him through preparing a bottle with her pumped milk, their hands brushing as she adjusted his grip. The contact sent electricity through her skin, a reminder of the attraction that had complicated everything from the beginning. Support his head like this. Perfect, she murmured, their faces close as she showed him the proper angle. Kane's eyes met hers over Gabriel's downy head, and for a moment Casey saw the vulnerable man beneath the cold businessman. The man who'd held her hand during labor, who'd looked at their children with overwhelming love. They know your voice, Kane observed quietly, as Hope settled at the familiar sound of Casey's lullaby. I sang to them every night during pregnancy, Casey admitted. Even after they were born, I recorded songs and asked the nurses to play them. Something flickered across Kane's features, surprise, perhaps guilt. I didn't know. There are many things you don't know about me, Casey said without accusation. Just as there are things I don't know about you. The next hour passed in surprisingly comfortable cooperation as they worked together to feed and change all 3 babies. Casey marveled at how naturally Kane seemed to take to fatherhood when he dropped his walls, how gentle his large hands were with their tiny children. Why did you really want children? Casey asked as they settled the babies for naps. Not the legacy answer, the real reason. Kane was quiet so long Casey thought he wouldn't answer. Then, I grew up in this house. Beautiful, enormous, empty. My father was always working, always distant. My mother cared more about social obligations than parenting. I swore if I ever had children, things would be different. But you've been working constantly since they were born, Casey pointed out gently. I thought providing for them was enough, ensuring they had everything I lacked, security, opportunity, freedom from financial worry. His voice was barely audible. I didn't realize that what I wanted most was what I never had, a real family. Casey's heart ached for the lonely child he'd been. It's not too late. They're only 6 weeks old. You can still be the father you wanted to have. Kane looked at her with eyes full of hope and fear. And you? Could you be happy here, with them? With ... He didn't finish, but the unspoken word hung between them. Casey looked around the nursery at their sleeping children, at this man who'd bought her services, but might have found something more precious. Ask me again in 13 days, she said. When we both know what we're really choosing. 14 days stretched ahead of them. 14 days to discover whether the wall between them could become a foundation instead, whether 2 broken people could heal enough to give their children the family they deserved. The question was whether love could grow where only contracts had existed before. Drain from her face as she tried to process what she'd just heard. 7 days living with Kane, as if they were a real family, caring for their children together, pretending that love might be possible between 2 people who'd started their relationship with a business transaction. Your Honor, Sterling objected, rising to his feet. This is highly irregular. There's no legal precedent. Mr. Sterling, Judge Mitchell interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of decades on the bench. These children are 3 weeks old. They need stability, nurturing, and the opportunity to bond with both biological parents. 7 days will give them that chance while allowing both parties to observe each other in the role of parent rather than adversary. Casey found her voice. And if we can't reach an agreement? Judge Mitchell's expression softened slightly. Then I will make the decision for you based on what I observed during those 7 days and what serves the children's best interests. But I strongly encourage you both to remember that these babies didn't ask to be born into a legal battle. They deserve parents who can put their needs first. As the gavel fell, ending the most surreal court session of Casey's life, she felt a mixture of hope and terror that made her legs weak. 7 days with Kane and their children, 7 days to prove she could be the mother Hope, Faith, and Gabriel deserved, while living under the same roof as the man who'd broken her heart by treating their love like a business transaction. The ride back to Whitmore Manor was conducted in painful silence, the luxury sedan feeling more like a hearse as Casey stared out the window at the familiar landscapes that had once represented her prison. Now, they felt like a countdown to either salvation or the final destruction of her dreams. Delilah Park waited at the front door with tears streaming down her kindly face, holding baby Gabriel, while 2 nurses stood by with hope and faith. The sight of her children, her beautiful, perfect children, after 3 weeks of separation, nearly brought Casey to her knees. "My babies," she whispered, reaching out with trembling hands to take hope from the nurse. The moment her daughter's tiny body settled against her chest, Casey felt something inside her healing and breaking simultaneously. "Mama's here, sweetheart. Mama's here." She looked up to find Kane watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Gabriel cradled against his chest with the same protective tenderness she remembered from the hospital. For a moment, they looked like what they should have been. A family reunited, parents sharing the joy of their children. "They've been asking for you," Delilah said softly, wiping her eyes. "Well, as much as babies can ask, but they've been fussier than usual, haven't they, Master Kane?" Kane's jaw tightened slightly. "They're fine, Delilah. They've had excellent care." "Excellent medical care," Delilah corrected gently. "But babies need more than that, don't they?" The housekeeper's pointed words hung in the air as she led them inside. The nursery had been transformed during Casey's absence. 3 cribs instead of 1. Every surface covered with toys and blankets and all the expensive baby equipment money could buy. But despite the luxury, something felt cold about the room, sterile in its perfection. "I've prepared the adjoining suite for Miss Casey," Delilah announced. "You'll be close enough to hear the babies, but have your privacy." Privacy. As if privacy mattered when her children had been sleeping in this beautiful nursery without their mother for 3 weeks. Casey settled into the rocking chair she remembered from her pregnancy, holding Hope while Faith fussed in her crib nearby. "She's hungry," Casey said, recognizing the particular cry that meant feeding time. "The bottles are prepared," Kane said, moving toward the warming station with efficient movements. Casey shook her head. "I'm breastfeeding. I've been pumping and storing milk for 3 weeks, waiting to see my babies again." The statement seemed to surprise Kane. "You've been..." But the contract said nothing about breastfeeding. "The contract said nothing about a lot of things," Casey replied, settling Faith to nurse while Hope dozed contentedly in her arms. "It said nothing about how I'd feel when I carried them for 9 months. It said nothing about how it would feel to give birth to them. And it said nothing about how much I'd love them." Kane watched in fascination as Faith latched on and began nursing, her tiny hand gripping Casey's finger with surprising strength. "Doctor," Hartwell said bottle feeding would be more practical. "Practical," Casey repeated, the word tasting bitter on her tongue. "Is that what we're calling this? Practical?" Gabriel began fussing in Kane's arms, and Casey watched the powerful man who commanded boardrooms and business empires look completely helpless in the face of one crying baby. "He's probably hungry too," Casey said gently. "Here, let me—" She guided Kane through, preparing a bottle of her pumped milk, their hands brushing as she showed him the proper angle to hold Gabriel. The contact sent electricity through her skin, a reminder of the attraction that had complicated everything between them from the beginning. "Like this," she murmured, adjusting his grip. "Support his head. There. Perfect." Kane's eyes met hers over Gabriel's downy head, and for a moment Casey saw the vulnerable man beneath the cold businessman, the man who'd held her hand during labor, who'd looked at their children with such overwhelming love. "Casey," he began, his voice softer than she'd heard in weeks. But the moment was broken by Hope's cry as she finished nursing and needed to be burped. Casey shifted her attention to her daughter, patting her back gently while humming the lullaby she'd sung throughout her pregnancy. "They know your voice," Kane observed, watching Hope settle immediately at the familiar sound. "I sang to them every night," Casey admitted. "Even after they were born, even when I couldn't hold them, I recorded lullabies on my phone and asked the nurses to play them." Something flickered across Kane's features, surprise perhaps, or something that looked like guilt. "I didn't know." "There are a lot of things you don't know about me," Casey said, not meaning it as an accusation, but simply as fact. "Just like there are things I don't know about you." They spent the next hour in surprisingly comfortable silence, working together to feed and change all three babies. Casey found herself marveling at how naturally Kane seemed to take to fatherhood when he allowed his walls to drop, how gentle his large hands were with their tiny children. "They're beautiful," he said softly, settling Gabriel back in his crib while Casey rocked the girls to sleep. "They look like you," Casey replied, studying Hope's dark hair and the shape of Faith's nose that was unmistakably her father's. "They have your eyes," Kane countered. "All three of them. The nurses said babies' eyes often change color, but theirs have stayed the same warm brown since birth." The fact that he'd noticed such details surprised Casey. For 3 weeks, she'd imagined him treating their children with the same cold efficiency he'd shown her, but the man watching their babies sleep looked nothing like the calculating businessman who'd drawn up their contract. "Kane," she said carefully, "why did you really want children?" Not the legacy answer you gave in court. The real reason. He was quiet for so long that Casey thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "I grew up in this house. Big, beautiful, empty. My father was always working, always distant. My mother, she tried, but she was more interested in social functions than being a parent. I swore I'd be different if I ever had children. But you've been working constantly since they were born," Casey pointed out gently. I thought providing for them was enough, making sure they had everything I didn't have. Security, opportunity, freedom from financial worry." Kane's voice was barely above a whisper. "I didn't realize that what I wanted most was what I never had. A real family." Casey's heart ached for the lonely little boy he must have been, rattling around in this beautiful mansion with parents too busy or self-absorbed to give him the love he craved. "It's not too late," she said softly. "They're only 3 weeks old. You can still be the father you wanted to have." Kane looked at her then, and Casey saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Hope, fear, and a longing so deep it made her chest tight with emotion. "And you," he asked, "could you be happy here? With them? With ... He didn't finish the sentence, but the unspoken word hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Casey looked around the nursery, at their 3 sleeping children, at the man who'd bought her services but might have accidentally purchased something far more precious. 7 days stretched ahead of them, 7 days to discover whether the wall between them could become a foundation instead. "Ask me again in 6 days," she said, settling Faith in her crib and moving toward the door. "When we both know what we're really choosing." As Casey walked to her suite, she felt the weight of Kane's gaze following her, and she wondered if 7 days would be enough time to bridge the gap between the business arrangement that had brought them together and the family they might become, if they were both brave enough to choose love over fear. Chapter 8. When Masks Fall Away. On the 4th morning of their court-ordered cohabitation, Casey collapsed while reaching for a crying Faith, her fever-racked body giving out just as Kane entered the nursery with Gabriel's morning bottle, and in that terrifying moment he realized that losing her would destroy him more completely than losing his fortune ever could. "Casey." Kane's voice cracked with panic as he dropped the bottle and caught her just before she hit the marble floor. Her skin burned against his hands, her breathing shallow and labored, and the strong woman who'd defied him in court felt as fragile as spun glass in his arms. "The babies," she whispered weakly, her eyes struggling to focus. "Faith needs to eat, and Hope hasn't been changed since 5. "Forget the babies for a moment," Kane said fiercely, lifting her easily. "You're burning up. How long have you been feeling sick?" Casey's laugh was barely audible. "Since yesterday evening, but they needed me, and I couldn't let them down again." "You couldn't what? Ask for help?" Kane carried her to her bedroom, his heart hammering as he felt the dangerous heat radiating from her body. "Casey, you're their mother, not their martyr. You're allowed to be human." As he settled her on the bed, Kane caught sight of himself in the mirror and was startled by his reflection. Gone was the controlled businessman who never let emotion show. In his place stood a man with wild hair and terror in his eyes, a man who looked like his world was ending because the woman he'd tried so hard not to love was slipping away. "Delilah!" he called, his voice carrying through the house with desperate urgency. "Call Dr. Hartwell immediately." While they waited for the doctor, Kane did something he'd never done in his 38 years. He put someone else's needs before his own pride and fear. He bathed Casey's fevered body with cool cloths, held ice chips to her cracked lips, and whispered reassurances he wasn't sure she could hear. "You're going to be fine," he murmured, smoothing her damp hair back from her forehead. "The babies need you. The words caught in his throat, too dangerous to speak aloud to a semi-conscious woman. "Just hold on." Dr. Hartwell's diagnosis was both expected and concerning: severe mastitis complicated by exhaustion and dehydration. "She's been pushing herself beyond her physical limits," the doctor explained while preparing an IV. "Her body is essentially shutting down to force rest. The breast infection alone would be debilitating, but combined with sleep deprivation and stress." "Is she going to be all right?" Kane demanded, watching the doctor work with barely contained anxiety. "With proper care and rest, yes. But this is serious, Mr. Whitmore. Mastitis can become life-threatening if untreated. She needs antibiotics, fluids, and complete bed rest for at least 72 hours. Dr. Hartwell's expression was stern. No nursing, no baby care, no trying to prove anything to anyone. Kane felt guilt crash over him like a physical weight. While he'd been focused on legal strategies and protecting his parental rights, Casey had been quietly breaking apart, sacrificing her health for their children. "What can I do?" he asked, surprised by how much the question revealed about his feelings. "Take care of her," Dr. Hartwell said simply. "Handle the night feedings yourself. Let her body heal. Show her that she doesn't have to carry this burden alone." For the next 48 hours, Kane Whitmore, CEO of a billion-dollar empire, man who'd never changed a diaper before 6 weeks ago, became something he'd never imagined: a devoted caregiver and hands-on father. He moved a crib into Casey's room so she could rest while remaining close to the babies. He learned to distinguish between Gabriel's hungry cry and his tired cry, mastered the art of warming bottles at 3 a.m. without waking sleeping siblings, discovered he could rock all 3 babies to sleep while Casey dozed fitfully under his watchful supervision. "You don't have to do this," Casey whispered on the second night, watching him pace the room with a fussy hope while Faith and Gabriel slept peacefully. Her fever had broken, but she was still weak. "I can manage." "No," Kane said firmly, but his voice was careful. "You've been managing alone for too long. Let me help." "Why?" The question was barely audible, but it hit Kane like a thunderbolt. Why was he doing this? Why was he sacrificing sleep and schedule to care for a woman who was supposed to be a temporary arrangement? Why did seeing her suffer make his chest tight with unfamiliar pain? "Because you're the mother of my children," he said carefully, the safest answer he could give without revealing too much. But Casey's fever-bright eyes saw right through him. "That's not the only reason." Kane settled Hope in her crib and moved to sit on the edge of Casey's bed, close enough to feel the warmth of her presence. In the soft glow of the nightlight, with their children breathing peacefully nearby, pretense seemed impossible. "Because seeing you collapse scared me more than anything in my life," he admitted quietly. "Because for 48 hours I thought I might lose you, and I realized—" He stopped, afraid to voice what he'd discovered. "Realized what?" Kane looked at this brave, stubborn woman who'd fought him in court and then trusted him enough to let him care for her in her weakness. "I realized that somewhere along the way, this stopped being about custody arrangements. It became about you." Casey's breath caught, and Kane saw tears gathering in her eyes. "Kane, I know I have no right to feel this way," he continued, the words coming easier now that he'd started. "I bought your services like you were property. I treated you like a means to an end instead of a person. I tried to separate you from your children because I was too frightened to admit what I really wanted." "What did you really want?" Kane reached out to touch her face, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek with reverent care. "You. All of you. The children, yes, but also their mother. The woman who sang them lullabies before they were born. The woman who fights like a tiger to protect what she loves. The woman who makes this cold house feel like a home." Casey's tears spilled over, and Kane caught them with his fingers. "I thought you didn't believe in love." "I didn't," Kane said softly. Until I watched you hold our children and realized that love isn't something you purchase or contract for. It's something you discover in the middle of the night when you're caring for a sick woman and 3 crying babies and somehow everything feels exactly right." "Kane!" Casey tried to sit up, but he pressed her back against the pillows. "Rest," he murmured. "We have 10 more days to figure this out. 10 more days to decide if we're brave enough to be the family these children deserve. And if Judge Mitchell rules against us." Kane's expression hardened with determination. "Then we'll appeal. We'll fight every court in the country if necessary. These children belong with both their parents, Casey. They belong with us." The word "us" hung in the air between them like a promise, fragile but precious. Casey closed her eyes, exhaustion finally overtaking her, but not before Kane saw something in her expression that made his heart race: hope. As the night deepened around them, Kane kept vigil over his makeshift family. When Gabriel woke for his feeding, Kane was there with a warmed bottle. When Faith needed comforting, he rocked her while humming a half-remembered lullaby from his own childhood. When Hope simply wanted to be held, he cradled her against his chest and told her stories about the strong, beautiful mother who was fighting so hard to keep them together. Watching Casey sleep, surrounded by the children they'd created together, Kane felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. The walls he'd built around his heart Walls constructed from his father's emotional coldness and reinforced by years of disappointment began to crumble, replaced by something infinitely more powerful and terrifying. Love. Not the desperate need for control that had driven him to seek a surrogacy arrangement, but real love, messy, inconvenient, terrifying, and absolutely necessary. He loved Casey Weston. He loved her strength and her vulnerability, her defiance and her forgiveness. He loved the way she made their children laugh, the way she'd fought him in court, the way she looked at him now like he might actually be worthy of redemption. And for the first time in his life, Kane Whitmore understood what his father had never taught him. That true strength didn't come from building walls around your heart, but from having the courage to tear them down for the people who mattered most. 10 days left to convince Casey that the man who'd bought her services had somehow become the man who couldn't live without her love. 10 days to prove that miracles really could happen, even for someone who'd forgotten how to believe in them. Chapter 9. Love's Secret Confession. On the final night before their court-mandated 7 days ended, Casey lay in the soft glow of the nursery's nightlight, pretending to sleep while her heart shattered and healed simultaneously as she listened to Kane Whitmore pour his soul out to their children in words he thought she'd never hear. "Your mama is the strongest person I've ever known," Kane whispered to baby Gabriel, who'd woken for his 2 a.m. feeding. Casey kept her breathing steady and her eyes closed, desperate to hear the words that might finally reveal the man behind the mask. "When I first met her, she crashed into my car in the rain, and instead of apologizing, she told me to stop acting like the world owed me everything." Casey's heart clenched at the memory. That night felt like a lifetime ago, when she'd been just a struggling coffee shop owner, and he'd been the arrogant stranger who would change her life forever. "I should have known then that she was going to turn my world upside down," Kane continued, his voice so soft Casey had to strain to hear him. "But I was too stupid and too scared to see it." Through her barely open eyelashes, Casey watched Kane settle into the rocking chair with Gabriel, his large frame looking almost comical in the delicate nursery furniture. But there was nothing comical about the tenderness in his voice or the way he cradled their son like he was holding something infinitely precious. "I thought I could protect myself by treating her like a business transaction," Kane admitted, gently patting Gabriel's back. "I told myself that if I kept everything clinical and cold, I wouldn't get hurt. I'd learned that lesson from my father, you see. He taught me that love was weakness, that caring made you vulnerable to pain." Casey bit her lip to keep from crying out. The loneliness in his voice painted a picture of the little boy he'd been, desperate for affection, but learning instead that emotions were dangerous luxuries he couldn't afford. "But your mama," Kane's voice broke slightly. "She saw right through all my walls. She called me out when I was cruel, stood up to me when I was being unreasonable, and somehow still managed to be kind to me when I didn't deserve it." Gabriel made a soft cooing sound, and Kane's quiet laugh was filled with wonder. "You like hearing about your mama, don't you? Well, let me tell you something about her that I've never told anyone." Casey's heart hammered against her ribs as she waited for his next words. "I fell in love with her the night you were all born," Kane whispered, his confession falling like teardrops in the quiet room. "I walked into that hospital planning to take my air and walk away from the woman who'd carried him. But when I saw her holding you and your sisters, when I watched her become a mother right before my eyes, something broke open inside my chest." Casey felt tears sliding down her cheeks, but she didn't dare move or make a sound that might stop this precious confession. "She looked at you three like you were miracles, and I realized that she wasn't just the woman who'd carried my children. She was the missing piece of my soul I'd been searching for my entire life." Kane's voice grew thick with emotion. "But instead of telling her how I felt, instead of begging her to stay and build a family with me, I did what I always do. I tried to control the situation. I tried to take what I wanted without offering anything of myself in return. Gabriel had fallen asleep in his father's arms, but Cain continued talking, as if the words had been locked inside him for so long that they couldn't be stopped now. "I love her, son," he said simply, and those 3 words hit Casey like lightning. "I love her laugh, and her stubbornness, and the way she hums while she folds your clothes. I love how she fights for what's right, even when it costs her everything. I love how she makes this cold house feel warm just by being in it." Casey pressed her hand to her mouth to muffle the sob that threatened to escape. This was the man she'd glimpsed during their most intimate moments, the one who'd held her hand during labor and looked at their children with such overwhelming love. This was the real Cain Whitmore, the one he kept hidden behind walls of money and power. "I know I don't deserve her," Cain continued, gently placing Gabriel back in his crib. "I know I've hurt her in ways that money can't fix. But if Judge Mitchell gives me another chance, if your mama decides to stay and build a life with us, I swear I'll spend every day proving that I can be the man she deserves." He moved to check on Faith and Hope, adjusting their blankets with the careful attention Casey had learned to love over the past week. Watching him care for their children with such gentle devotion made her heart ache with longing for the family they could become if they were both brave enough to choose love over fear. "I want to give you 3 everything," Cain whispered to his sleeping daughters. "Not just money and opportunities, but a real family, parents who love each other and love you, a home filled with laughter instead of silence. I want you to grow up knowing that love isn't weakness. It's the strongest force in the universe." Casey could barely breathe as she listened to this transformation of the man who'd once told her that love was a luxury he couldn't afford. 7 days of living as a family had changed them both, showing them glimpses of what they could build together if they stopped fighting each other and started fighting for their shared future. "The truth is," Cain said, settling into the chair beside Casey's bed, "I need your mama more than she needs me. She's already proven she can love you 3 with her whole heart, that she can sacrifice everything for your well-being. But me? I'm still learning how to be human again. She's teaching me little by little that it's safe to feel, safe to hope, safe to love." Casey felt her resolve crumbling like walls made of sand. For weeks, she'd protected herself by believing that Cain was incapable of real emotion, that he saw her as nothing more than a means to an end. But listening to him pour his heart out to their children revealed a man desperate for connection, terrified of vulnerability, but willing to risk everything for the chance at love. "Tomorrow we go back to court," Cain said softly, "and I don't know what Judge Mitchell will decide. But whatever happens, I want you 3 to know that these 7 days have been the happiest of my life. Not because I got my way, not because I proved any points, but because for 1 perfect week, I got to pretend we were a real family." Casey couldn't pretend to sleep anymore. The words she'd been longing to hear had finally been spoken, and the man she'd fallen in love with, despite her best efforts, was sitting just inches away, believing himself unworthy of the very thing she wanted to give him. "Cain," she whispered, opening her eyes and seeing his shock at being caught in his moment of vulnerability. He went perfectly still, like a deer caught in headlights. "Casey, I thought you were sleeping." "I was," she said softly, sitting up despite the lingering weakness from her illness. "Until you started talking about love being the strongest force in the universe." The silence that followed was deafening. Cain looked like he wanted to run, to retreat behind the walls that had protected him for so long. But Casey reached out and caught his hand before he could escape. "Did you mean it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everything you just said about loving me?" Cain's eyes searched her face, looking for judgment or rejection, finding instead the same vulnerable hope that had been growing in her heart for 7 days. "Every word," he admitted, his voice raw with emotion. "I love you, Casey. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another person. And I know I don't have any right to ask for your forgiveness after everything I've put you through, but—" Casey silenced him by rising up and pressing her lips to his, pouring all of her own unspoken feelings into a kiss that tasted like tears and redemption. When they finally broke apart, both were crying openly, the walls between them finally completely gone. "I love you too," she whispered against his lips. "I've loved you since that first night when you were so gentle with me, when I saw glimpses of the man you really are underneath all that armor." Kane cupped her face in his hands like she was something infinitely precious. "Are you sure? Because once you say it, once we cross this line, I'm never letting you go." Casey smiled through her tears, seeing in his eyes the future she'd been afraid to dream of. A real marriage, a loving family, a partnership built on honesty instead of contracts. "I'm counting on it," she said, and sealed her promise with another kiss that felt like coming home. As they held each other in the soft glow of the nursery, surrounded by their sleeping children, Casey realized that Judge Mitchell's 7-day experiment had worked exactly as intended. 2 broken people had learned to love not just their children, but each other, creating the foundation for a family that would be stronger than any legal document. Tomorrow, they would face the court together, not as adversaries fighting over custody, but as parents united in love and determined to give their children the family they all deserved. And for the first time since that rainy night when she'd crashed into his car, Casey Weston believed in happy endings again. Chapter 10. 3 Rings, Endless Love. "We won't be needing your decision today, Your Honor." Kane Whitmore's voice rang through the packed courtroom as he stood hand in hand with Casey Weston, their love no longer hidden, but declared for all to witness. The courtroom erupted in surprised murmurs as Casey stepped forward, their 3 children sleeping peacefully in a carrier at her feet, blissfully unaware that their parents were about to shock the legal system. "We've reached our own agreement," Casey announced, her voice strong and clear. "Mr. Whitmore and I have decided our children need both parents, not in some custody arrangement, but as a real family." Judge Mitchell's eyebrows rose with barely concealed delight. "Are you telling me my 14-day experiment worked exactly as I hoped?" Kane squeezed Casey's hand, drawing strength from her touch. "Your Honor, 14 days ago you told us to remember that our children didn't ask to be born into a legal battle. You were right. They deserve parents who can put their needs first, who love each other enough to give them a real home." "And you found a way to do that?" Judge Mitchell asked, though her knowing smile suggested she already understood. "We're getting married," Casey announced, and the collective gasp from the gallery was audible. "This afternoon, we want to give Hope, Faith, and Gabriel what they deserve, a family built on love instead of contracts." Marcus Sterling shot to his feet, his expensive suit unable to hide his bewilderment. "Your Honor, this is irregular. The custody arrangements still need legal formalization." "Mr. Sterling," Judge Mitchell interrupted with obvious amusement, "when 2 loving parents decide to marry and raise their children together, custody becomes a family matter rather than a legal dispute." Janet Rodriguez grinned as she gathered her papers. "Your Honor, if the parties have reached mutual agreement, the court's intervention is unnecessary." Judge Mitchell banged her gavel with the satisfaction of a woman who'd just witnessed justice and love triumph together. "Case dismissed. And might I add, this is the most beautiful resolution I've seen in 30 years on the bench. I'd be honored to attend your wedding if you'll have me." As they walked out into afternoon sunshine, Casey felt like she was floating. Media swarmed with cameras and microphones, but Kane simply wrapped his arms around her and their children, shielding them from chaos. "Mr. Whitmore, Miss Weston, when did you know you were in love?" Kane paused at the courthouse steps, looking every inch the powerful CEO, but with something new in his expression, pure joy. "Love isn't something that happens overnight," he said simply, "but sometimes it takes a crisis to make you admit what's been growing in your heart all along. We're grateful for Judge Mitchell's wisdom in giving us time to remember what really matters: family." The ride back to Whitmore Manor was filled with nervous laughter and tears as Delilah Park wept openly at their news. "Oh, my dears," she sobbed happily, "I've been hoping for this since Miss Casey first arrived. This house has needed love for so long." "Delilah, we want to get married today," Casey said as they entered the foyer. "I know it sounds impossible." "Nonsense," Delilah declared, already mentally planning. "The conservatory is perfect for weddings. Master Kane's grandparents were married there. I'll call Reverend Matthews and the florist. You two focus on your vows and let me handle the rest." Kane looked skeptical. "A wedding in 6 hours? Sir, I've been running this household for 20 years. If I can't arrange a proper wedding by evening, I don't deserve my position." Delilah was already reaching for her phone. "Besides, all the important elements are already here: the bride, the groom, the babies, and enough love to fill this entire estate." Within hours, Delilah had worked miracles. The conservatory's glass walls were draped with white silk and thousands of tiny lights, transforming the space into something